What makes franchises so popular? As a kid, I always loved watching my favorite TV shows and movies for days on end. It was the only thing I would ever do whenever I woke up out of bed just by sneaking into our basement, turning on Cartoon Network, or just to watch the Star Wars movies over and over again. I've done it so much to the point whenever I watch episodes from those shows or movies from beginning to end, it would all be engraved in my head that I would end up dreaming about hanging out with these characters or imagining what kind of different adventures they could go on. Now as I've gotten older and changed my college major, I recently wanted to get back into that feeling of wanting to watch shows or movies that grasp my attention to think, just as I did as a kid. I chose two TV shows that originally appealed to two different demographics. One show was aimed towards an older and mature audience with darker tones and themes, while the other was for a younger audience, particularly young girls. But what they needed to have in common was a passionate fan base that stands the test of time. The first was Game of Thrones because my mom used to watch it before it got less popular towards the end. And my reaction to the show, at least the first season from what I've only watched, was insanely good. And that it was easy to see why it was such a massive cultural shock when it first aired back in spring of 2011. But the show for the younger audience, particularly for young girls, was My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic.
What?
At first, this might seem like a bizarre choice, but there's a big reason why I chose this. This was because I was familiar with the show growing up, but I obviously never watched it. Yet I knew about the response and finally wanted to see what it was all about. This is also a show that had a massive culture shock like Game of Thrones had, but this show, it was much bigger. It first aired in fall of 2010, and it immediately had the strangest reaction. So many people of all ages, even adults, fell in love with the show. In fact, many pieces of media online have made music videos, fan art, forums to discuss the show, and even wrote their own fan fictions based on the themes and characters. This is where Transmedia comes into play, and it has been something that has also connected to franchises. But why does Transmedia have such an impact on franchises? What do the franchise's creators have to say about it? Does it make Transmedia more popular than the original writing? And more importantly, why does a show like My Little Pony have this type of reaction? This essay will discuss the impacts of Transmedia and franchises such as MLP to keep the show relevant today, as well as the many elements of Transmedia that help support it. First of all, we need to ask, what exactly is Transmedia and how is it used in pop culture? According to Henry Jenkins' article in Transmedia Adaptation and Extension, he says that transmedia is a process where integral elements of a fiction get dispersed systematically across multiple delivery channels for the purposes of creating a unified and coordinated entertainment experience. In other words, we are taking the ideas the many stories we see tell to us and use it as inspiration to make new experiences for fans instead of going back to the original material again. That is what fans have done to all of these popular franchises like MLP, so they can make new content for fans to enjoy. Jenkins also differentiates transmedia with adaptation and extension, where he says that adaptation is understood as a version or retelling of the original, whereas an extension goes beyond the original. So an adaptation can be like a what-if scenario on a character like Princess Luna and her backstory of being banished by her older sister, or even a music video based on Luna's backstory. Or an extension can be a fan fiction to tell more about her relationship with her sister. It goes to show that transmedia can be anything as long as it relates to the original source material. In this day and age of media rising, we now have more access to different types of media. Therefore, there is now an endless amount of ways we can create new practices to redefine the norms of storytelling, which leads into immersion. Mark J. P. Wolf describes immersion as three different types: immersion, absorption, and overflow as a liquid metaphor. Immersion is essentially the first step in experiencing an imaginary world. This leads to absorption, or as Wolf calls it, a two-way process. On one hand, our attention is sucked into worlds like watching the very first episode, which is actually 2 episodes introducing our protagonist Twilight Sparkle and the remaining cast. It helps us know what the overarching plot of the show is and help understand where it can go. However, on the other hand, Wolf says that the audience also absorbs the imaginary world as well, bringing it into mind, learning, or recalling its places, characters, events, and so on, constructing the world within their imagination the same way that memories bring forth people, events, and objects when their names are mentioned. But what happens when those countless stories continue to add up and end up exceeding the ideal amount for one person to have? This continues Wolf's liquid metaphors as the third and final type of overflow comes in. Basically, the knowledge we know from the show's world called Equestria, we knew as kids, go away as our methods of thinking change as we get older. Nothing that we keep in our minds can last forever, and it all becomes saturated. Eventually, something will be left out, like the things we recall as we were young, and our new ways of thinking, how it helps shapes our new ideas. An example that Wolf talks about is a character named Starlight Glimmer, who was introduced in Season 5 as an antagonist, but redeems herself at the end of the season, becoming a part of the main cast of characters. She continues to redeem herself in later seasons, so our knowledge of who she once was changes as we get in later seasons and get older. This information shows that our immersion changes as we get older, which gives us imagination for new forms of media. While Transmedia helps bring in new people to a franchise to help make new stories, it can sometimes lead to downsides. Mainly, it shifts the idea on who is in charge, giving the new audience the correct view of the franchise. Antonio Garcia writes about Transmedia redefining storytelling in her article, saying, although stories have been told across mediums in the past, the affordances of new technologies and the saturation of media in different forms are reshaping when and how stories are told. Stories are being told everywhere in every way imaginable, and Transmedia is forcing itself to be distant from what was originally being written at first, like in the pages of a book. In addition, there has also been a struggle for MLP to maintain its double audience. While the show's initial target was aimed at young girls to keep its toy marketing intact, it also needs to keep its more older audience engaged that were often referred to as bronies. Isabelle Lecara-Guillaume talks about this in her article, saying MLP develops its own form of double address, where an additional layer of discourse will only be available to a specific group, not merely adults, as would usually be the case, but more generally people who are familiar with internet, pop culture, and have mastered its codes. Because its fans of both sides of the spectrum had their own responses, the creators responded. One example was a background character named Derpy, a fan favorite who appeared in more episodes. It also shows that the idea for who cartoons are made for changes. If a story's initial target was towards younger kids, anyone else of any age could also enjoy it. And I think MLP excels in finding ways for both audiences to enjoy it. They found the messages, themes, and characters spoke to them on an unusual level that they wanted to have more of the show. In conclusion, Transmedia definitely plays a massive role to help shape a story that we know as it is today. It may be difficult to find how a story can continue to advance so you could keep the audiences engaged, even if you plan out that story for a long time. But the fact that even one simple episode, character, or plotline can spark so much discussion and works of art is incredible to see. Sure, Transmedia may have its downtimes on whoever takes over, but making new materials is always fun to do. It is the passionate fan bases that make franchises like My Little Pony Friendship is Magic timeless. I still go back and visit these worlds just to see how they hold up. In the end, it makes me nostalgic just to see these shows and movies again, just as I did as a kid.